Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our weekly seminar series. And I'm very happy to host Jacob Andreas today. So let me first briefly introduce him. Jacob is an assistant professor at MIT working on building intelligent systems that can communicate effectively using language and learn from human guidance. He earned his PhD from UC Berkeley and his Master's of Philosophy from Cambridge University, and his BS is from Columbia. And he has worked at Microsoft Semantic Machines, where he founded the language generation team and helped at conversational AI capabilities to Microsoft Outlook. In the past, he has received several paper awards at Knuckle and ICML, and today he will talk about a very interesting topic, language models as word models. The stage is yours, Jacob.
Great. Thank you very much for the introduction. So yeah, at a high level, what this talk is going to be about is understanding whether models trained just to sort of generate text learn to build representations, not just of maybe linguistic structure, not just of word meaning, but actually representations of the world that text is describing. So I want to start with an example that's a couple of years old at this point. From Marcus and Davis, and actually originally taken from Eugene Charniak's PhD thesis. The example goes as follows. Janet and Penny went to the store to get presents for Jack. Janet said, "I will buy Jack a top." "Don't get Jack a top," said Penny. "He has a top, he will ... And if we take this prefix, this prompt, and we plug it into what was then a state-of-the-art language model, we get the following completion. I guess this was from GPT-2, which says, "Get a top. I will get Jack a top," said Janet. And when these kinds of examples started coming out of language models, there were a number of things that were really, really remarkable about them, right? In this case, the model has stayed on topic. It knows the names of all the people involved in the situation. It knows enough about sort of social conventions and discourse conventions to know that Janet is likely to speak next in this conversation. And we get all of this sort of complicated, like, above the sentence level behavior just from training a generic neural network model in text, right, which was certainly not true as recently as like 5 or 6 years ago. The other thing that is interesting about this passage is that it's total nonsense, right? Penny says, "Don't get him a top." He has a top. Janet says she's going to get him a top. This example was quickly fixed in GPT-2 type models, but it's easy to find things that are sort of qualitatively similar, that are in the neighborhood of this example. Sometimes that are still even challenging for the biggest models that we have today. But obviously we can get these kinds of both successes and mistakes in much larger documents. We can really get like long form coherent descriptions of entities and situations and events, occasional semantic anomalies, right? The model doesn't know how many horns a unicorn is supposed to have, and discourse weirdness. But really it seems like the better and the bigger these models get, the more they're capable of generating not just well-formed sentences, but like really entire well-formed stories or entire long conversations. And I think it's easy to forget how recently these kind of results were just like totally unimaginable, totally shocking. I think hardly anybody in the NLP community, even in like 2018, 2019, would have expected that you could do this by scaling up current tools. And I think part of the reason for that is that, certainly this kind of behavior, you just fundamentally cannot get out of any sort of count-based language model, any sort of n-gram-based language model. And it seemed like we never got these kinds of behaviors out of recurrent network RNN language models either. And so it seems like there's something sort of fundamental representational going on inside these transformer LMs that we have nowadays that allows them to build in their representations, right, the kinds of models of the world that you need to support coherent text generation. And so this talk is really going to be about understanding whether and how and to what extent the language models we have today actually represent the world that they're talking about, and whether we can then use our understanding of sort of how they do language understanding to make them better or to make them more controllable.
Hi, Jacob.
So let's dive right in, and I want to start by talking about a paper from a couple of years ago that was at ACL 2021, just trying to understand how these representations are structured in the first place. So, just to sort of briefly remind this group, the class of models that we're talking about here, what's a language model, and specifically what's a transformer language model? It's some kind of neural network that assigns to every token in a sentence a sequence or a sort of stack of contextual representations, and it constructs these representations by attending to all of the previous words in the sentence, but not to all of the next words in the sentence. So, in this case, I'm going to build some initial representation of the word book by looking at the word John has and then I'm going to build a representation of the word he by looking maybe at the representation that I built of the word book and everything else all the way down. And eventually, at the very end of this process, we get a representation of the final word in a sentence, or I guess the last word that we've produced so far, and we use that representation to predict what word ought to come next. So what would it mean for a model like this, for a model with this structure, to explicitly represent or explicitly reason about the world that it's describing in text? So here's a sort of cartoon of a world representation. When somebody says the sentence, or when you see in a document the sentence, Janet and Penny went to the store to get presents for Jack, we're going to build some kind of explicit symbolic representation of all of the sort of entities and events and properties that are in the world that looks a little bit like this, right? So here's all of the entities and events that we know about. Here are the relations that we know about that exist between these entities. For the formal semanticists in the room, I'm going to play pretty fast and loose with event semantics in this talk. We're mostly not going to be thinking about events. We're just going to be thinking about properties. But here's one way you might do it for purposes of this demonstration. And important as what we've drawn in this figure is what we haven't drawn. Right, based on the sentence, we don't know whether or not Jack already has the top, and maybe even specifically the top that's located in the store. We don't know what color the top is. There's various other pieces of information that just haven't been described, haven't been made available to us in this one sentence yet. And so we're going to sort of represent our uncertainty about these things by omitting them from this diagram. And so we're going to call these kinds of graph-shaped state representations information states. Right, they represent not actually the underlying state of the world, but our information about the current state of the world as it's been made available in text. And if I now add another sentence onto the end of my original sentence, to grow this discourse, I'm going to think of the meaning of that sentence as specifying an update to my world representation. That now I know that this possessive edge is present. I know that this colorful edge is not present, or sorry, that this colorful edge is also present, and everything else is basically staying the same. And here's an alternative sentence that we might tack onto the end. She gave it to him. In addition to various events that we're not showing, the end result of Janet giving the top to Jack is that Jack possesses the top. And an important thing about this is that this is never explicitly stated in the sentence, right? It sort of comes from our knowledge of language, our knowledge that a side effect of A giving B to C is that C winds up having B at the end of this procedure. And so we're going to think of these as being part of our information state as well, not just sort of specific facts that are asserted by the sentences that we're trying to model, but also all of their logical consequences. So this cartoon that I've been drawing comes from a big literature on dynamic semantics and sort of linguistics and philosophy of language. In contrast, I think, to the kinds of formal semantic approaches that especially people in the NLP world have often seen, we're going to think of sentence meanings here, right? Not as a function from possible worlds to truth values, but as a function from information states to new information states. And so we can wind up with things like Jack possessing the top, even that's never explicitly stated. I want to emphasize also that this is really a sort of pragmatic notion of meaning that we're going to be thinking not just about sort of literal changes in the sentence, but the effect that they have on the world, maybe the effect that they have on a listener's belief. And these kinds of models of dynamic semantics turn out to be really useful for thinking about and building hypotheses about how representations might be structured in current ML models and language models in particular. And why is that? You might imagine that if I had access to this nice structured world representation, something like this, it would help me with lots of downstream NLP tasks, right? I could do language generation by figuring out what entities are available to me to talk about. I could do entailment prediction, natural language inference by taking pairs of these graphs and sort of superimposing them on top of each other and figuring out whether they're consistent or not, and so on and so forth. Now, obviously, current models don't build explicit graph structured representations like this. They have no supervision for doing so, and more fundamentally, there's, kind of in that big stack of vector representations that we were looking at before, there's nowhere to put an explicit symbolic representation of meaning. But to the extent that we think these kinds of meaning representations might be useful for downstream prediction, it's reasonable to ask whether models trained to do next word prediction might sort of implicitly construct representations like this, even sort of fake representations like this, that are being used to support those predictions. There's another perspective that I think is useful for thinking about the kinds of representations that language models might be constructing, and that's sort of generally thinking about this as a latent variable problem. Right? How is it in the sort of real generative process that describes the world that a document gets written? Well, at some point, the world was in some particular state or some progression of states that we want to describe. There are rules, rules of physics, rules of social conventions that govern what kinds of state transitions are possible, what kinds of states are a priori plausible. And if we know how the world works, we can place some kind of probability distribution over states and over transitions between them. Now, when we generate text, figuring out what sentence comes next fundamentally involves inferring what states are compatible with the beginning of the text you've seen so far, right? What did the world look like up until the word that you're trying to generate in this document, and then using that to figure out what's allowed to come next, right? And so in particular, right, if we think of this with our sort of normal latent variable hat on, we might really want to think of language modeling and what any sufficiently good language model is going to do as the problem of doing inference in this distribution over possible world states. And so we might want to look for representations of that distribution. And that's exactly what these information states, in a very, very crude sense, are meant to capture. So if language models are solving this next sentence prediction task by doing this kind of inference, then what we expect them to do is to produce in their representations information, recoverable information about this distribution over possible states of the world. And so what we're going to do right now is just try to find that distribution inside some kind of big language model. And the setup for this is going to be as follows. We're going to take some sort of neural LM. In this case, it's going to be, I think, a BERT or a BART and a T5 model, sort of generically an encoder-decoder model. We're going to feed it some input sentences. We're going to train it to predict the next sentence as shown. We're going to gather up a bunch of documents, much smaller than the training set, but big enough to learn something from, where we have access to some ground truth notion of the information states being described by these documents. So I know in the sort of context of the beginning of this thing that we're showing on the left, there's a door, the door is locked, there's me, there's a key, I'm holding the key. And figuring out whether these states are encoded by models is now a probing problem, right? That looks exactly like the kinds of probing problems that we've used to figure out how models represent syntax, how models represent basic kinds of lexical semantics. We're very good at this. We know how to design these experiments now. And so the question is just, how do we build some kind of probe that recovers these information states specifically? We're going to do that, as a standard by trying to build some kind of little machine learning model that reads off these state representations from the text representations being built by the language model. These state representations, right, are big, complicated objects, so we need to be a little bit clever how we do this. And the pieces of that are going to be the following three steps. So we're going to read these components of these meaning representations off piece by piece, right? So if I think of this graph as representing a bunch of kind of atomic propositions, like I have the key, the door is locked, and so on. I'm, for every proposition, going to train some kind of model that tries to judge whether that proposition is true in the document that we have in the input. And to build a model that can sort of predict the truth of a proposition given a textual input, we need to answer a few questions. First, how to represent these propositions in the first place. And here, we're going to do something really simple, which is that we're just going to assign them vector embeddings using the same encoder as the language model itself that we're trying to understand. So I'm going to take the sentence, the door is locked, I'm going to pass that through the encoder, I'm going to average the representations together, and I now have a representation of the door being locked. Second, we need to figure out where information about each of these propositions is located within the language model's hidden representations, right? And remember that we're building not not like an RNN where we're just building one representation of the entire document. Here we have a representation of every word that's been mentioned so far. And what we're going to assume specifically is that information about the truth of a proposition is local to mentions of the entities that are named in that proposition, right? So here concretely, when we say the door is locked, we're going to assume that that information is located in the contextual representation of the word door, or maybe something close to it. And we're going to we're going to revisit this assumption later on. And finally, given a representation of a proposition, given a representation from a language model that we think encodes that proposition, we just need to get out the truth value of that proposition. And here we're going to do something really simple, which is just train a linear model to predict these truth values given the representation of the proposition and given the representation of the sentence. And so if we can, and we're going to train this using this little data set of state representations that we collected before. Notice, right, this little machine learning model that we built to recover these state representations, the only free parameters this model has at all are in this matrix W. And so if this works, it means these, complicated, highly structured state representations are encoded up to a linear transformation inside the language model itself. Right, so certainly this is not a probe that's powerful enough to do any kind of non-trivial semantic inference. And so if we can succeed, right, that means there's some piece of our language model's representation space that really is homomorphic to the human-defined or some human-defined space of meaning representations, even though this language model has never seen a meaning representation of itself. And that's really all there is for the method in the first section of this talk. And the only question is how well we can actually do this. We're going to be looking here at two different tasks. The first of them is the alchemy data set of Long et al. This was originally an instruction following data set where you see these colored beakers. You get an instruction and you have to predict the next sequence of colored beakers. We're going to turn this into a language modeling task by just generating a string representation of the initial state of the world and then asking models to predict what sequences of instructions are allowed to come next. These are highly context dependent, right? I'm only allowed to say mix if there's a beaker that involves two colors that can actually be mixed together. I can only, say pour out a beaker if I know that that beaker has some liquid in it. I can only pour into a beaker the contents of another beaker with less in it and so on. So there's a lot of sort of really rich state modeling that you need to do just to do next instruction prediction. And these, they're relatively simple environments. The language itself is all generated by crowd workers. There's a bunch of linguistic variation. The other environment that we're going to look at here is the text world environment of Cote et al. This is a text adventure game. If you ever played, Zork or any of these old school computer games, this basically looks like this. They have a simulator that generates versions of these games on the fly. So this is all synthetic text, but again, involves sort of complicated state representations. As you're moving through an environment, only a set of objects are available to you at any given moment. Their states, or they are stateful and the states matter. And so these are also, these two environments between them are going to let us get at, a couple of different ways in which these kinds of world modeling problems might be important. And with all that, let's get straight into the results. And so the main thing to notice here is that with that model that I was describing to you on the previous slide, we can recover exactly the entire states of most entities that are mentioned in these discourses exactly. And so in the alchemy world, we can, sort of exactly recover the state of 75% of beakers, 75 in a BART model, 76 in a T5 model. They're pretty similar. I should note that the sort of trivial baselines for these tasks are reasonably high. If you assume that all entities remain in their initial state in the discourse, and you assume you have sort of oracle access to that initial state, you get 63% accuracy here. And if you assume that things just sort of remain in their most frequent state and you don't look at the text at all, you get 32 in alchemy and 82 in text world. But the main thing to notice here is that even relative to these trivial baselines, we can recover a substantial fraction of entity states exactly. Another question we can ask here is where these representation, and so I guess really just to underline this, right? Take this as some initial evidence that language models are, in fact, building structured state representations of exactly the kind that we hypothesized at the beginning of this talk. Another question we can ask is where these representations come from. And in particular, whether it's sort of necessary to see a lot of in-domain data, whether it's necessary to do a lot of pre-training, or the combination of both of those things. And remarkably, so the results we were looking at before are in models that were sort of pre-trained in the way that T5 was pre-trained, and then fine-tuned specifically on the text of these two data sets that we were looking at here. But if we don't do that, accuracy only gets a tiny bit worse. And if we do no pre-training or no fine-tuning at all, we just use these models off the shelf, we can still recover most entity states exactly. Conversely, if we take these models and we fine-tune them specifically on these data sets, you don't actually do much better at building these structured representations than if you just use a randomly initialized model. And so the important thing to notice here is that this seems to be a function of scale, right? That only when we really train these models on a lot of data for a long time do you acquire these kinds of nice representations, even if you can learn to do the task decently well without pre-training. And finally, we said before that one of our modeling assumptions here was going to be that information about entities was going to be local to their mentions in a discourse. So let's evaluate that in a slightly more fine-grained way. And we're going to do that by taking this probe and pointing it now at different positions in the sentence and retraining the probe for every position in the sentence. So, you know, if we're trying to figure out whether this third beaker is empty at the end of this discourse, first we're going to point it at the word that's, you know, I guess one to the left of the mention of the beaker, or one to the right of the mention of the beaker, train our probe. The probe is 64% accurate, and then point it at all of the other positions here relative to the mention, and retrain the probe from scratch and see how well we can do. And in this case, we find for this alchemy task that actually most of the information is on not quite the mention of the entity, but the 3 or 4 tokens to the left where its sort of initial state is being described. And in particular, if you pointed at any other part of the discourse, if you pointed at the wrong beaker or whatever else, you can't do this task with above chance accuracy. And so this maybe is a kind of explanation for why transformers work so much better than other even kinds of neural models for these language modeling tasks. They give us access to this very natural, you know, kind of like memory data structure where we can separate information about different entities and their states from each other. And the picture that all of this suggests is something like the following. The first time an entity gets mentioned in a discourse, the language model is going to construct inside the representations of that entity some little data structure in which it's going to store information about that entity's state. And when text describes a change to the entity state, that change is going to get written back into this sort of repository of entity information. If you have a bidirectional encoder, like the ones we've been working with here, this can even come before the information that happens later on. In a unidirectional encoder, we sort of expect this to be located just in the last mention. But in any case, we have this sort of dynamic representation of entity state that gets updated every time the state changes. And the language model's world representation, to the extent that it has one, is a collection of these local entity state representations. And I draw this in this particular way very suggestively because it looks an awful lot like some of those original dynamic semantics papers that I was citing earlier, right? So if you think about like Heim's file card semantics, which is attempting to explain a bunch of linguistic phenomena that we're not attempting to explain here, but just the like basic pieces of it really do look exactly like this picture. We have a representation of every entity, and we accumulate information about state changes that entity undergoes. And so what this all suggests, you know, right now we've just shown that we can read this information off of language model representations, but not that language models are actually using these representations in the way that we would expect to do language generation. So we're going to first test this by doing one very simple experiment, which is we're going to build 2 documents, that describe the same initial state of the world, but one of which has as a final consequence that the first beaker is empty, and the other of which has as its final consequence the second beaker, right? So 2 initial state representations that are the same, final states that are different, and the difference is induced by the final sentence in each of these things, as we've drawn on the slide. We're now going to build sort of Frankenstein representation by putting these together. So we're going to take the embeddings of the sort of first entity description from the first sentence in the encoder. We're going to take the embeddings of the second entity from the second encoder, and then we're going to keep around all of the other information that was produced by the first encoder. So I now have a representation produced by my language model that doesn't correspond to any string that I could hand to the language model encoder at all, right? There's no text that I can plug in to the language model that will give me exactly the sequence of 4 sentence descriptions or 4 clause descriptions. Nevertheless, if this sort of hypothesis about how models work we've built is correct, then we expect this representation to be describing a state of the world in which both of the first 2 beakers are empty. And in particular, this has consequences for the kind of text that I'm allowed to generate downstream of this representation. I'm not allowed to say anything about the red beaker or about the first beaker. Rather, I'm allowed to pour things out of the third beaker only and not the other 2. And I'm allowed to pour things into either of the first beakers, but not into the final beaker. And in fact, if you sort of look at what sentences this model judges to be plausible or implausible, it behaves in the way that we would expect. That if we sample from the model in this new context, 80% of the generations that we get are consistent with this combined context. And if you had sort of not done this modification procedure and used either just context 1 or context 2 without modification, you would get to a much smaller fraction of consistent sentences. And so this is, again, very preliminary evidence, and we'll come back to it in a minute. These models are actually using these representations, or that there's a causal relationship between these representations and downstream things. So I want to emphasize here, and to say this again and again throughout this talk, that this behavior exists alongside like glaring semantic errors, even in really big modern LMs, sort of GPT 3.5, GPT 4 size things. I want to note a couple of papers that have been specifically looking at these kinds of hard discourse phenomena. A paper from Schuster and Linzen last year, looking at whether models would sort of make assertions about entities that shouldn't actually be accessible under sort of theories of how discourse work. And you get these kinds of errors, and models are very easily confused about how to attribute facts if there isn't an obvious place to write them in. There's also a bunch of linguistic phenomena that we sort of don't have a picture for in this account. Like, what do we do with quantification? What do we do with implication? What do we do with counterfactuals? What's nice is the sort of representational theories we started with, these file card semantics or discourse representation theories, spend most of their time thinking about how to represent exactly these phenomena. And I think if we wanted to do a deep dive here, there would be ways of looking for these other things as well. That being said, it's been sort of gratifying since we published this work originally to see this sort of basic file card theory of language model representations, right? That sort of facts about entities or located dimensions of those entities to get validated in a couple of different ways by people working on other kinds of NLP problems, right? So some of you may have seen this work on editing factual associations in language models from Kevin Mung last year. And what they find specifically is that, if I sort of take the tokens and the representations in a language model, and I look at which tokens can be deleted with an effect on downstream model predictions and which tokens can be deleted or perturbed without an effect on downstream model predictions, you get this sort of pattern of activity where, if I want to change what the model says about the Space Needle, I need to either mess with the last token in Space Needle or right before the model makes a prediction. And if we rotate this diagram on its side, we can see that it's in fact exactly the diagram that we've been drawing in this talk so far. That information about the Space Needle that the model uses to make predictions about the properties that the Space Needle has is located early in the model, 2 mentions of Space Needle. So this does seem to really be a robust finding. And for that reason, as we're going to see in a minute, you can actually use it to do a bunch of other cool things. The last thing before I close out this section, we've been choosing to represent the state of the world in a particular way, a particular formal framework. There's been a bunch of other work going on, especially looking at more sort of complicated perceptual aspects of language that also finds evidence for structured meaning representations of various kinds that look very different from the ones that we've been talking about. So you can get at this question in a few other ways, and sort of they all seem to point in roughly the same direction. So to summarize here, we've shown evidence that language models produce at least very simple representations of world states, of sentence meanings, and the effect that they have on the world And we've shown that in a very simple case, these states can be manipulated with predictable effects on model output. At the same time, right, we know models are wrong, we know these predictions are not 100% accurate, and there's a lot of work to do to make these things better. And so what I want to talk about next is the work that we've been doing in our group aimed at exactly those things, trying to make these probes both more, or these representational theories, I guess, more reliable as predictors of model behavior and as tools for controlling model behavior. So this is a preprint that we have up on arXiv called Measuring and Manipulating Knowledge Representations in Language Models. I think I don't have the link on the slide, but I can share it at the end. So let me show you one figure that should maybe throw into question a little bit of the results that I was showing in that last intervention experiment in the previous section of the talk. What we're looking at here, every dot corresponds to a sentence, and the x-axis tells us whether our probe was able to recover the true state of that entity, and the y-axis tells us whether the thing that the language model said about that entity next was actually semantically acceptable. And there's a correlation here, but it's a very, very, very weak correlation. And what it tells us in particular, right, is that these probes, even if we can do these sort of quartz state manipulation operations, don't necessarily allow us to do like fine-grained prediction of model errors. And one hypothesis for why this might be happening, or why the sort of reason that we training the probe in the way that we did in the previous section of the talk will give rise to this distribution. And that's the models are wrong a lot of the time, right? So there have been many sort of highly public examples at this point of language models hallucinating facts, both sort of about entities when you just ask them questions against their background quote unquote knowledge, and contradicting themselves in the context of individual passages where they'll assert one thing here and then assert something else later down. And this is true, again, in even like the very, very biggest models that we have access to today. And so thinking about this slide and thinking about the probing experiment in the first part of the talk, what this suggests is that, what do I expect my probe to do if I'm training it to predict the ground truth state of an entity, but I have some sort of behavioral evidence that the model itself has not correctly inferred the ground truth state of the entity. And so the main thing here is the probe that we were looking at before doesn't actually, or its training data and the manner in which we're training it is not sensitive to the actual causal dynamics of the model itself. We're trying to suck ground truth information out of a model that doesn't necessarily predict the ground truth with high reliability. And so what we're going to try to do instead is to modify this basic procedure that we had before in two different ways, one of which really aims at predicting model behavior. So not just what was the ground truth state of the world, but what is the model, quote unquote, believed to be true right now. And then also to specifically learn interventions that allow us to do sort of fine-grained manipulation of model behavior directly in representation space. So here's the probe that we showed before. We're going to use this as our starting point again. All the experiments that I'm going to show later on are now going to be with a big decoder-only model, a sort of GPDJ type thing. But structurally, this is very similar. And if you want, you can think of the decoder as just pointing at that last contextual word representation. Right, so just to say what I said before, if we take this basic probing setup that we had before, just because we're training the probe to predict the ground truth thing, and that doesn't imply that the model will generate text that's consistent with the ground truth thing. And so a better thing to do here would be to use as our labels not ground truth state information, but the state that's consistent with the model's own output, right? So in this case, if I input to the model, you see a locked door, and the output from the model says you lock the door. The model doesn't think the door is locked. The model thinks the door is unlocked. And we really, if we want a probe that explains model quote unquote beliefs, we want a probe that predicts that this thing is true. And so we can do this, right, by just gathering, sort of comparing model outputs to ground truth state representations, backing out entity state information from those things, and then using this to train the probe in exactly the same way that we did before, but now on the model's own output rather than on the ground truth. And we're going to call this our state reader model that we've just trained to imitate the model. What about state writing? What about changing the beliefs that models have about entities in a discourse? And here this is going to be a little more complicated, right? There's a bunch of different facts that sort of live side by side in one of these contextual entity representations, and we'd like to be able to touch one of them without affecting all of the other ones. And so we're going to need to actually learn some sort of surgical intervention procedure that will allow us to do that kind of fine-grained editing in a way that just like swapping out entity representations from the previous section did. And we're going to do this in the following way. We're going to start by gathering a big data set of contexts that underspecify what the model should do next, that we're showing in blue. New facts that provide additional information that hasn't been asserted in the context that we're showing in red. And then correlated facts, facts whose probability we want the model to increase if this new fact is true, in addition to everything that's in the context. And with a big data set of these sort of 3 fact pairs, we're going to build some kind of editing model that just learns to take a context representation and modify it to incorporate a new fact. And we're going to train this model specifically so that when the modified representation is plugged into the model in place of the model's own representation, it increases the probability of this correlated fact. And so once again, we have an editing model that's parameterized just by a single linear transformation of an encoded proposition, and we're going to train that to sort of edit the representations produced by a model to increase the probability of sentences that are not fully supported by a context. And we're going to call this our state writer model by analogy to the state reader model. So just to kind of summarize here, right, we have our language model, which is producing contextual representations. We have our fact encoder, which is producing representations of specific new facts. We're using the same encoder for both of those things. And we've described now how to train a better version of the probe from the first half of the talk, a state reader that tells us not just what humans think is true, but what the model thinks is true, and a state writer that we've trained to specifically cause the model to act as though it believes other things to be true. So what can we use these reading and writing models for? The first thing that we're going to look at here is exactly those cases of hallucination that we saw in the at the beginning of this section, right? And so, you know, in GBDJ models and even in bigger models, some fraction of the time, if you give them a prompt like this one, Gordon focuses on cases pertaining to business litigation, blah, 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 blah. Gordon has the occupation of. There's enough information in this context to tell us that the model believes, or to tell us that Gordon is an attorney. But models don't always predict that Gordon is an attorney. And especially when there are sort of strong cases of gender bias and other spurious feature correlations, models will often ignore this input and maybe just pay attention to the name and what kinds of occupations and things a person named Gordon has. And so we're going to try to predict, before generation actually happens, whether the model believes that Gordon is an attorney or whether it believes that he's something else. And we're going to do that by just taking this reader model and applying it with a bunch of different fact representations corresponding to different occupations. And we're going to figure out which of these is scored the highest, which of these beliefs the model has most strongly. In this case, maybe it is attorney, and we predict that the model is going to do the right thing in this context. And in fact, if we sample from it, it predicts that Gordon is an attorney. We can do this for other things as well, right? And when we predict that the model is going to be, that something else has a higher score than the ground truth thing, we're going to predict that the model is incorrect. And often we do actually see that. We can use this technique to discover not just factual or sort of hallucination in the sense of contradicting the context and ignoring a passage, but also sort of background factual knowledge inside models, right? So here we're just taking the prompt Sundar Pichai, who's currently the CEO of Google, and we want to ask our state reader whether the model believes that Sundar Pichai works for Google or whether it believes it to be more likely that he works for Apple. And, you know, so even out of context, we can use these state readers to tell us information about models, sort of like background beliefs, prior beliefs about specific named entities. And so here is an evaluation of this hallucination prediction task. I really want to emphasize that, you know, this is not hallucination detection of a kind that you could sort of apply to a model out in the world. It requires us to know ahead of time what the ground truth information is, but a measure of whether this tool actually is then, when we know what's true, figuring out whether the model is going to say something true or not. It turns out a very, very strong baseline for this task, especially for these factual errors, is just not learning any kind of model at all and just comparing the embedding of the occupation to the embedding of the entity mention itself. This should maybe not be so surprising. We know that, for example, like vector analogies still work in transformer representations, and that. Nevertheless, if we take our reading model and we use it to perform this task, it performs very, very well, both at incoherence detection and factual error prediction. And in particular, it performs, as we have to do with all probing tasks, this is a behavior that's specific to models, to language models, and to training to predict entity representations. If we sort of shuffle the labels, or if we randomize the weights of the model, we can't recover the same accuracy. So the probe is not able to memorize things here. And as a sort of final, sort of funny note, and maybe most interestingly here, it turns out that if you use the editing model that I showed before, right, which was not designed to do this task at all, it actually does quite well in some cases, better than all these other baselines at predicting incoherence and factual errors. So the directions that the editing model is finding to push our representations in seem to also be directions that are useful for classifying model behavior. And some evidence now that the read model and the write model are actually converging on the same direction or approximately the same direction. Okay, and then the last thing that we said here was that we were going to try to use this model, which we trained to do editing, to actually edit models' representations and see if we can do controlled generation this way. So here again are sort of bias and bios prompts. We have little passages about people describing their occupation. And it turns out that even in a GPT-J-sized model, they're very bad at paying close enough attention to these particular passages. And so if I just take all of these sentences, Johanna's research looks at German integration policies, blah, 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 blah. I give that as a textual prompt to the model. The model fails to predict that she's actually a professor at this institution. Similarly for this design professor down at the bottom. And so these are cases where textual prompting fails, and where it seems to be the case that there's some string that we want to generate, and there isn't an easy way to write a natural language prompt that actually causes the model to generate that string. Nevertheless, if we use this technique, which I realize I haven't actually said the name out loud, but we call it REMEDI for representation mediation. If we use this writing model that we described before, now we actually get the right thing in all of these cases. And we can do this not just to sort of fix in context prompting errors, to do this kind of like superhuman prompt engineering or something directly in representation space, but also to modify models' prior factual associations, right? So here's a case where we can, just by editing the contextual representation of Sundar Pichai, make the model believe that he works for Apple, make the model believe that Airbus planes are created by Dodge, and so on and so forth. So let's look at some numerical evaluations again. And we're going to compare now two sort of state-of-the-art techniques for model editing, most of which aim to change model behavior by changing their weights, or all of it, which I should say, change model behavior by changing their weights rather than by changing their representations. And so in particular, if we just take the sort of new fact that we want the model to assert and we fine tune on it, that's really good at causing the model to place high probability on the new fact. That's this efficacy measure, but it breaks everything else in the model. So you fine tune the model on Sundar Pichai as the CEO of Apple, and now it believes that everybody in the world is the CEO of Apple. Here's our prefixing model that we showed before, right, where we don't change the weights and we just provide the text at the input. This is much less efficacious at changing model behavior. A little more than 25% of the time, models produce the wrong output just with a textual prompt, but it doesn't change anything else because we only apply this prompt, for the entities that we want to change. If we look at our method, it does very well on both the efficacy measure. It fixes almost all of these cases. And again, it only applies to specifically those entities that we're trying to modify, because we're doing that modification not in the model's weights, but instead directly on token mentions. And finally, if we compare to the kind of state-of-the-art model editing technique, which is Rome, that is a little bit more efficacious. There's a couple of percentage points of sentences that it fixes that REMEDI doesn't, but much less specific and sort of smears a bunch of probability around. Finally, we can use this not just to change sort of textual information about entities, either in or out of context, but other aspects of models' linguistic knowledge as well. And so here we've trained this probe to edit definitions of words instead. So I have, I want the model to believe now that like, I don't know, a fork is used for chopping wood. And so I'm going to learn and edit to the contextual representation of fork that causes the model to believe that forks are used for chopping wood. And the cool thing that happens here is that models increase not only the probability that forks are used for chopping wood, but a bunch of other stuff that you would sort of expect to be correlated with an entity being usable for chopping wood, right? We also increase the probability that a fork is a weapon, that a fork is dangerous, that a fork has a handle. And so this is some evidence that we're not just memorizing the specific string that we want to memorize, but actually sort of modifying the model's entire conceptual system and moving this fork representation around in a way that gives it a bunch of other properties that you would sort of expect in a common sense way to be associated with chopping wood. And if we compare this in particular to the original features, those don't change that much for the most part. So we're leaving a bunch of forkiness stuff in place. We're not just turning forks into axes. And finally, if you look at a bunch of random features, those change in sort of more complicated or hard to predict ways. Good. So the code for all of this is online if you want to play around with it. There is a preprint up. The framing there is a little bit different from the framing that I gave in this talk. In particular, we've been calling this REMEDI read model a supervised baseline or supervised skyline, and then realized that hadn't really been done before. So that's now sort of part of the method coherently, but the results that I've been talking about are all there. And to summarize, by learning to intervene in representations produced by a language model, by learning a model not sort of ground truth, or by training a probe that models not ground truth information about the world, but information about the language model itself, we can discover encodings of facts that are causally related to language model output, that allow us to predict when models are going to make mistakes, and that allow us in some cases to control model behavior better than we can exert, or control model behavior with more precision and more efficacy than we can do in a textual format. And with that, I will wrap up there. As always, all the credit goes to the students who actually did the work here, and thank you all very much for the invitation.
Thank you, Jacob. And yeah, we are open to questions from our audience.
Okay, so maybe I can start, Hojam. I have a couple of questions, and some of them are kind of conceptual, and some of them can be a little bit more technical. Also, I think it would be nice to discuss the state representation issue, which was about the first part of talk. But my first question is going to be about this REMEDI method as in itself. Is it an intervention to the encoder state representation or decoder input? Because in the first part of the talk, you showed us that language models are good at encoding state representations, right?
Yeah.
So
in the second half of the talk, we're actually using decoder-only models, so there isn't a sort of encoder-decoder distinction. And so in particular, for all of these, let me try to find a slide showing this actually. Right, this model is just processing the sentence from left to right. And so we're just taking the last mention of every entity and doing the modification there.
I see, thanks. And also, I would like to ask you about whether the averaging representations is a good technique. And also in the examples of the REMEDI, what I can see is that you are only using a single fact and trying to incorporate. So what happens if we want to incorporate multiple facts from different distances? So is it possible with this framework?
Yeah, so we haven't experimented with making multiple changes at the same time. I think there's no reason to expect that it wouldn't be possible. And in fact, all you need to do in the training procedure is, train the probe so that if you stack multiple of these facts on top of each other, they don't interfere with each other. So I think it would be relatively easy to collect the training data that you need for that, but it's not an experiment that we've done. Maybe one reason to not be quite as optimistic as I just said is that in the all this model editing work, it turns out to require a bit more work to apply multiple edits sequentially. And so there's a whole follow-up to this Rome paper that's actually at iClear right now trying to do this. But I don't think there's any reason in principle that you couldn't sort of get the data in a way that would allow you to learn to edit multiple things at the same time. Yeah, and then I guess the other question was just why represent these propositions via averaging rather than taking the last token or anything else. Honestly, we haven't done a ton of exploration in this direction. We know empirically that averaging is really good, even like zero shot without a probe at all in this whatever representation similarity baseline. I expect that you could come up with better aggregators than the one that we're using.
I see, and I have a couple of more, but I think I will keep them. And I think we have a couple of questions from the audience. Deniz Hocam, would you like to start?
Oh, thanks, Gürkan. Thanks, Jacob, for a great and informative talk. I just want to make sure I understand certain pieces. My first question is related to Gürkan's question, I guess. So when you're probing or modifying representations, what you mean is you basically take the position of the last mention of the entity you're interested, and you're modifying the output, the final output of the final layer of the encoding, and you're basically manipulating or reading that vector. Is that correct?
So it's not the final layer, and for different kinds you need to make the intervention in different places. Yeah, and so in fact, what happens is that maybe we modify like the representation at the third layer or the fourth layer, and then we recompute all of the representations that are downstream of that in the computation graph, which means everything above it and everything to the right.
I see. So that means, for example, when you're changing the meaning of a word like the fork, chopping wood example, so your modification might be actually closer to the bottom, word embedding layer, because you want to change the whole meaning of the thing, not just the contextual use. I assume, correct?
Yeah, that's right. I don't remember exactly what layers we're editing at here, but and a couple interesting things about that are one, so the model editing people have found that when you're making these representations, want to do them sort of about here in these models, like between layers 10 and 20. We learn when we sort of optimize over the position to do the edit, to intervene earlier in the model. And what we think is going on is that there's some, like fact retrieval circuit that's going to kick in around layer 10, and you need to change the representation in such a way that not only is the new fact there, but the model then doesn't try to like overwrite it or do something else with the other fact that it was otherwise going to pull out of its knowledge base about this entity. And so figuring out exactly what these things are doing, or if there's any more interesting structure and representation space, I think is a really interesting question, and just not something that we've had a chance to do in a fine-grained way yet.
Thanks. Well, final question. We have a couple students in my group working on sort of long-term memory properties of these things. So it seems to me like you're assuming the information about the state of an object is carried through those objects' mentions, and the later mentions, they basically accumulate more information from the history. And I'm assuming we're assuming that the language model is taking care of like anaphora resolution and implicit references and stuff. So when you say mention, it could be a pronoun or a noun phrase, etc. And the language model is expected to load all the information in that on top of that last mentions vectors.
Yes, that's right. And so I guess two implications of that are, one, wherever we're editing for these like multi-hop things needs to be higher up than whatever part of the model is performing an AFR resolution. And like I was saying before, we know that there are lots of examples where models don't actually do this all that right, where they sort of fail at an AFR resolution. And so this is, I think, as a in the second talk, especially, trying to build a model that's robust to the fact that, or a sort of probing and editing procedure that's robust to the fact that often the information that we're looking for is not actually there.
Yep. So we found that sort of when we plot, when we separate the position where the information is given and the position where we ask the question, and when you have lots and lots of text in between, so there's a certain effect on the performance. So these things have trouble remembering across long distances, and of course, obviously, if you go out of the window of the transformer, the effect is more pronounced.
Yeah.
So there's several sort of memory mechanisms that try to carry the information across. People use memory tokens or various mechanisms. But I'm from your talk, I'm inspired to think that instead of just carrying around random vectors and hoping that, like an RNN, the model will sort of put the useful information in them, we could potentially detect what the relevant entities are and where their last vectors are, and just carry those around with us going forward if we're reading a long novel or something.
Yeah, I mean, that would be really cool. So I guess two things there. One, like especially in the models, the sort of encoder decoder models that we were looking at the beginning of the talk, what it means to be a mention is a little fuzzy, and things are not exactly where you want. So you maybe want some attention mechanism or something to try to figure out where exactly around the entity things are located. That being said, both we and other people who've looked at this in bigger models and in decoder only models are finding that much more consistently the information really is just in the last token of the mention. Yeah, I mean, that would be a natural thing to do. I would be very interested to hear what happens.
Thanks. I'll let the students ask more questions.
I can ask a question. So thanks a lot for the talk, Jacob. And my question is that there is a recent paper from Google, named Larger Language Models to In-Context Learning Differently. And it suggests that while small LMs rely primarily on semantic priors from pre-training, large models can override these semantic priors when represented with in-context exemplars that even contradict priors. So do you think that a similar pattern could be observed with a larger model like Palm or GPT-4?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. I guess generally the question of how does all of this interface with, or what does it mean for not just text generation, but more exotic language model phenomena like in context learning. I mean, a non-interesting answer to that question is that you could certainly imagine using this to try to guess, as models are doing in context learning, whether they've constructed the right hypothesis or whether they're paying attention to the input examples at all. So my student and coach grad, former Dennis student, Ekin Akurek, is actually at iClear right now presenting some work on how we think in context learning works in these big models. And the hypothesis, at least, is that there's a representation of the function that you're trying to learn that's encoded specifically in specific locations in models' hidden parameters. And so I think if we could localize that in real large scale models, then you could imagine using this kind of technique both to figure out whether models that are doing ICL are doing it right, and maybe kind of by analogy to these experiments over here, just reaching directly into the model and saying, here's the function that I want you to apply, even if we don't know how to generate a sequence of examples or a textual instruction that directly specifies or precisely specifies that function. But yeah, there's lots to do here, and I think it's a really interesting problem.
Thank you. I have another question. If another person don't have a question. So it is a bit of a fancy question. So in a nutshell, by combining these recent works, your recent works, where we can manipulate entity representations, and like use LMs as agent models, like what research steps should be taken so that I make a copy of myself as a language model and make it write like emails or stuff? So
yeah, so I think maybe one high level point that I want to make here is that I've been most of the work that looks at factual knowledge and language models and using language models and knowledge bases thinks of the information as being represented or language models knowledge as living inside the parameters. And I think this is not quite the right way to think about it, in the sense that, right, what's a language model, at least without instruction tuning, right? You're training on the entire internet. The internet was written by a bunch of different people at different moments in time where different facts were true, who maybe disagreed about what the facts were at the moments that those things were written. And so I don't think you necessarily expect a model in a sort of abstract sense to encode coherent knowledge at all. But what models do, right, is they learn to simulate authors of individual documents who do have coherent self-contained beliefs. And so I think, part of our original motivation for thinking of knowledge probing, knowledge editing as something that you do in representation space rather than in weight space was exactly because I think you sort of only expect these models to do these things in context. That being said, you obviously can't specify you can't take, everything that you believe to be true about the world, or probably even like put enough bits to distinguish you from any other author that the language model has ever seen into a single contextual representation that's like the last token of your name or whatever. So I think probably, there are ways in which you could generalize this to just get more information into these edit operations that we're performing. Maybe we don't even try to like modify embeddings of individual tokens in context already, but just like put extra stuff into the prompt that doesn't correspond to any text token at all, that contains the additional information we want the model to have. I think the hard part there is like, how do you get a complete specification of some individual person's whatever beliefs, goals, and so on and so forth. But maybe it's enough to say, I'm going to take all the text that you've ever written, and I'm going to learn a model that looks like this REMEDI W model, or even maybe that looks like just prefix tuning, and construct some sort of prompt that in representation space that causes the model to believe or to behave like you. But that's a very hand-wavy answer.
thanks a lot.
I have another question. It is about the fact that we are applying REMEDI procedure after pre-training. We have the language model and we find out that it is actually not working well, and we are trying to fix it, as the name suggests, or remedy. But is it possible to use a procedure like yours during the training itself? I know, like in your paper, you mentioned a couple of procedures like this, but is it possible to apply your kind of work in training so that the model will be acting correctly all the time?
Yeah, that's a great question. In principle, what you could do is use it as some kind of consistency loss. So I guess thinking about the reading model rather than the writing model, we could say, take these ground truth labels, and in cases where we have documents annotated, require that models contextual representations of the true facts encode in this kind of dot product way, in this representational way, in addition to in their outputs, the things that you want them to encode. We have a paper that's in review right now that's called Language Modeling with Latent Situations, that does like a version of this, also at a fine-tuning stage, but changing the weights of the model rather than learning an editor. It works. It doesn't work quite as well as I would have wanted, and I think some of that's just that it's very hard to get this kind of annotation at scale, and so when you do it for little problems like this, you wind up with sort of small biased sets of annotations that you can only use to fix model behaviors in a limited way. But yeah, I mean, if you're interested in seeing what we're thinking about in that direction, I would start with the language modeling with latent situations paper, but I think there's a bunch more that you could do, especially thinking about these kinds of, using edits to predict what an edited or what a changed representation ought to look like.
See, thanks. Yeah, thank you. I don't have any follow-up questions, I guess, about this. So I'm looking forward to reading your coming paper.
Thank you again, Jacob, for this really insightful talk. Okay, so let's thank our speaker, everyone.
Thank you.
See you all in our next talk. Bye.
Yeah, thanks, Jacob. Bye.
Bye.